A warm welcome to you all to today's webinar. My name is Sarah Martin, and I'm the Senior Manager of Programming and External Relations at the Center for Effective Philanthropy. The theme for today's discussion is A Sector in Crisis, How Nonprofits and Foundations Are Navigating Challenge. We're so glad that you're joining us today. So this webinar will focus in part on findings from a new CEP research report titled A Sector in Crisis, How U.S. Nonprofits and Foundations Are Responding to Threats. Along with this report, we also released a companion piece, which is a 2-page board insert for sector leaders to use for ease of discussion with your boards. We'll be adding both of these to the chat shortly. And for those of you who are tuning in who are new to CEP, I'd love to share a little bit about us. Our work is focused on philanthropic effectiveness, and for 25 years, we have sought to help foundations and increasingly individual donors improve their effectiveness and increase their impact. We do this through assessments and research reports that often lift up the perspectives of those who wouldn't otherwise be heard, as well as programs like this one. We also do this through our Youth Truth Initiative, which harnesses student perceptions through validated surveys and tailored advisory services to help school leaders and education funders accelerate improvements. On behalf of CEP, I want to thank the funders who supported the report we'll be discussing today: the Conrad N. Hilton Foundation, the Houston Endowment, and the Prebice Foundation. This research also draws from CEP's Nonprofit Voice Project, which was funded in part by the Rita Allen Foundation and the McKnight Foundation. Next, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. So, of course, we are in webinar format, which means you all are muted and will have your videos off upon entering the session. And if you have questions for the panelists today, and we really hope that you do, please type them into the Q&A box in the Zoom control panel. We'll try to respond to as many as we can during our Q&A time towards the end of the webinar. We will not be using the hand raising function on this webinar, as we're not asking attendees to speak their questions. And if you do run into any technical difficulties, please feel free to reach out to the CEP events team at events@cep.org, and they can assist you. And I'll put that email in the chat as well. We'll also be sharing some resources with you via the chat box, so feel free to check there for helpful links. And if you'd like to enable live captioning, you can do so in your Zoom control panel by clicking the CC closed captioning button. Finally, this webinar is being recorded, and we will send a link to all registrants in a follow-up email next week. Now that housekeeping is out of the way, I have the privilege of introducing our speakers and panelists today. So moderating today's session is CEP Vice President of Assessment and Advisory Services, Kevin Bolduc. Kevin will be in conversation with our 4 fantastic panelists: Elisha Smith Arrillaga, Vice President of Research at CEP and lead author on the report we'll be discussing today; John Hecklinger, co-CEO of the Global Fund for Children; Robin Peacock, Executive Director of MEND New Jersey; and Cathy Cha, President and CEO of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund. We're so grateful to all of you for joining us today. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kevin.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to the so many of you who registered for this webinar. It's one of CEP's most subscribed to webinars, and we're really looking forward today to a real conversation about what's happening in this moment in our sector and how we're collectively responding. As Sarah mentioned, I lead CEP's assessment and advisory work at CEP. For 20 years now, I've had the chance annually to read thousands of candid comments from nonprofits about what's top of mind for them, what their funders are doing well, and what their funders could be doing better. And in that time, I've seen grantees' descriptions of their relationships and experiences with their funders move increasingly from comments about transaction to more relational comments, from process-focused kind of comments to more flexible and supportive modes of support from their funders. But this year, grantees' comments have a really new dimension that I haven't seen in the last couple decades. More so than we've heard before, those comments include a sense of fear for the people and communities that nonprofits are serving, and a moral struggle as they sometimes feel compelled to compromise on approaches and values just in order to be able to continue their work. Some nonprofits feel their funders are standing right at their sides, and others see funders who had been leaders in their areas of work unexpectedly grow silent. As Elisha will describe, it is a deeply challenging moment for funders and nonprofits alike. It's also a deeply confusing moment. The broad contours of a meaningful philanthropic response are, of course, in no doubt, nonprofits need resources now to help them fill gaps, to weather threats, and to continue absolutely crucial work in their fields and their communities. But how to build the most effective long-term response remains a much debated subject. So to help us make sense of this moment, we have a fantastic panel of leaders, each of whom is deeply engaged in navigating our current context. As Sarah mentioned, Robin Peacock is Executive Director of MEND. MEND is a hunger relief network in Essex County, New Jersey. It has a mission to strengthen the health of the community by increasing access to fresh and healthy food, and it works to advance health equity and influence system-level change through collaborative, community-driven, and innovative programming. John Hecklinger is co-CEO of Global Fund for Children. GFC and its partners pursue a shared vision of securing a safe, vibrant, and equitable future for all children and young people. And as an intermediary working around the world, John brings a distinct global perspective to this conversation, drawn from leading an organization that is both a funder and a recipient of grants. Cathy Cha is president and CEO of the Evelyn and Walter Haas Jr. Fund, where she has been an outspoken champion of work to advance equality and justice so that every person can thrive and live life with dignity and hope. The Haas Jr. Fund works on issues of democracy, immigration, and college success, all areas that have become more complicated and more challenging given this administration's actions. And my colleague, Elisha Arrillaga, our Vice President of Research, designs our research agenda and leads our ongoing nonprofit voice panel. She's a frequent speaker and podcast guest on issues of nonprofit and funder effectiveness, and she's also a trustee at the St. David's Foundation in Texas. Elisha is going to kick us off by grounding us in the data from our recent report, A Sector in Crisis. And then we're going to jump into a conversation which I've asked each of our panelists to be as specific and candid as they possibly can as they describe where they see challenges for both nonprofits and funders and talk to us about what they've seen funders do well. So with that, Elisha, I invite you on screen to kick us off by talking about the first key finding in our report, which really focuses in on nonprofits' experiences over the last year.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin. And I'm really excited for this discussion today. I am going to share my screen so we can walk through the research findings. So I am really excited today to talk with you about a report that we published a few weeks ago, A Sector in Crisis, How U.S. Nonprofits and Foundations Are Responding to Threats. In addition to the full report, there's an interactive website that folks can go through with the high-level findings at www.cep.org. And then there's also a companion piece with the report, which is a 2-page insert, which should be really easy for folks to insert in board books. And the reason we created that 2-page insert this time is so that, it's a tool to help boards really get on the same page about what is happening in this moment for both foundations and nonprofits. Now, before we move into the findings, I did want to take a minute to thank the primary author of this report, Ellie Buteau, and all the research team, Sierra, Christina, Danny, and Caroline, who were really diligently on pulling all of this data together, and also the members of the programming and external relations team here at CEP, who this work could not have happened without as well. As Kevin mentioned, I'm really excited to hear reactions after this conversation from the panelists. And then before we start, I also want to take a minute to thank the funders of this work, the Hilton Foundation, the Houston Endowment, and the Previs Foundation. This research also draws from CEP's Nonprofit Voice Project, which is funded in part by the Rita Allen Foundation and the McKnight Foundation. And thanks are also due to our amazing advisory group, who were instrumental in shaping the study survey and interview questions, our analysis, and our sense-making of the data. Now, at CEP, we've been doing our best to provide data to foundations and individual donors as quickly as we can about what is happening and how the current context is impacting the nonprofit sector and communities across the country through a number of timely research reports. And we plan to continue tracking what's happening over the next few years to help funders develop a greater understanding of the new and perennial challenges and opportunities facing the social sector. Now, our most recent surveys that we'll dig into today of nonprofit and foundation leaders on this subject were conducted in the fall of 2025. At CEP, we differentiate our data from others in three important ways. First, representative samples. Second, our rigorous analysis of the data. And third, our timely reporting of our findings. Now, the foundation data shown in this presentation is representative of all private or community foundations in the U.S. that give more than $5 million annually. And our nonprofit data draws from a representative sample of U.S.-based nonprofit organizations that have received funding from at least one foundation that gives $5 million or more annually. Now, in terms of who we heard from in this data, 408 nonprofit leaders and 227 foundation leaders responded to our surveys, which resulted in response rates slightly higher than our typical of CEP research, at 46% and 30% respectively. We also interviewed almost 60 foundation and nonprofit leaders in order to really dig into and explore some of the key themes and takeaways from the survey data. So, what do we find out from all of our data collection last fall? Unsurprisingly, to many who have been working in the social sector this year and last year, nonprofits told us that 2025 was an incredibly difficult year for them, describing this as a time of existential threat to their organizations and to the communities that they serve, as they deal with both greatly increased demand for their services and significant funding cuts. Now, as illustrated on this slide, the majority of nonprofits, more than 80% of the over 400 leaders we surveyed, told us that they have already experienced or anticipate increased demand for their organization's services. And at the same time, almost 70% of nonprofit leaders report experiencing a reduction in funding from government or private sources. Notably, if we look at the bar in the middle of the chart that's depicted here, we see that over a third of leaders say that their organizations saw a reduction in foundation funding in 2025. And if we look at the last bar here, we see that almost 70% of organizations experience a decline in funding from at least one of these sources. This quote illustrates much of what we were hearing from leaders. We have a food pantry, and we have seen more use of our food pantry than at any other time in our organization's history. So we're just seeing increased need and increased anxiety across the board with everyone that we work with. All of these challenges have resulted in significant financial and operational uncertainty for nonprofits. Almost 3/4 of leaders report concerns about their organization's overall financial stability due to the current context, and over 2/3 say this time has negatively impacted their ability to carry out their work. This quote exemplifies the very real fiscal hardship facing nonprofits and illustrates much of what we heard from nonprofit leaders. Approximately 80% of our revenue is federal funds. Last year, we were already anticipating facing the fiscal cliff because of the end of COVID funding. Our revenue last year was about $17 million. It's about $10 million this year. I'm working on next year's budget, and if we lose the federal funds we have, we'll be down to probably $4 million. As a result, 61% of nonprofit leaders that we surveyed report that the current context poses substantial risk to the continued operation of their organization. These are existential challenges for many nonprofit organizations in the country. Nonprofit leaders also told us that they're responding to these financial challenges in a number of different ways, and they're being creative and courageous. They're taking actions like pursuing new funding opportunities or seeking increased funding from existing funders, using reserve funds, cutting their programming or services, or eliminating staff positions. Now, that's the nonprofit story of 2025. And I'll pause before we dive deeper into some of the foundation data.
Thank you, Elisha. Those findings are sobering. And I'm going to invite Robin, John, and Cathy to join the screen now. We'll begin our conversation on this finding. And Robin, I want to start with you. You are a nonprofit. You've probably experienced some of exactly what Elisha is reporting that we see more broadly. So the work of Men New Jersey is really to strengthen the health of your community by increasing access to fresh and healthy food. Those are the kinds of things that have been directly affected by government actions, like the cancellation of local food purchasing programs. Would you tell us the story of MEND in 2025 and where these findings ring true for you or diverge from your experience?
Sure. Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, Elisha. I have been saying, in our office to our team that all of 2025 felt like COVID 2.0. Those of us running nonprofits have felt like we've been in crisis mode since then, quite honestly. And then I looked at our data and I realized that the numbers of people coming to our pantries actually has risen 42% since 2021. So it was already a shock to the system then, and it's just been a continued steady increase in demand for programming since then. So, I'm not saying anything people on this call probably don't realize, but there's a lot of stress on the nonprofit system just in terms of community need. Then you layer in federal policy changes. So in our case, changes to SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, we are predicting that the demand is going to continue to rise. We are in the fortunate position of not having relied on a lot of federal funding historically, but we were affected last year by the cancellation on fairly short notice of something called the Local Food Purchasing Program, which was a beautiful program that paid farmers to grow food that was then fresh produce, basically, that was then put through the charitable food system. So you're giving farmers good pay, you're giving people food that they want, and that was taken away. So we had to work to find other funding for that. And thankfully, we were able to do that. But I know that many of my peers, especially those that had a lot of federal dollars as part of their budget, are still in kind of panic mode. The last thing I'll say, and then I'll pause, is, we're preparing as if these federal, policies and funding are going away. Like that's the mode, that's the approach we're taking. Let's prepare and be ready and, build programming that can scale either direction, depending on how funding goes, depending on how demand goes. And that can be challenging. But it also requires us to think pretty creatively on how to be responsive to this moment.
Thanks, Robin. I'm sure we'll continue that story as we continue our conversation, but I want to turn it to John now. You obviously work globally. The data that Elisha shared is from US nonprofits, even if some of them are working around the world. I just read a report last month from an organization or two organizations in Africa, Firelight and Epic Africa, that documented that 60% of US supported civil society organizations working in Africa had scaled back their work and 20% had shuttered entire programs. So data that is at least as stark as what Elisha was sharing. Given your global work, can you help us understand what your grantees are experiencing and what you'd like funders to know about their experiences and needs right now?
Yeah, and thanks. I really appreciate joining this call to give the global perspective. And yeah, it is stark with the dismantling of USAID and essentially the collapse of the whole foreign assistance architecture. It has thrown our environment into a bit of chaos. And just for a little bit of context, we're, as you mentioned earlier, we're a public foundation, so we raise the money and we fund like truly community-based organizations in 40 countries. they typically have budgets of under $100,000 per year. So they're not the kinds of organizations that are generally working directly, with a USAID. Maybe some occasional small projects here and there from the embassy, but they're not. We didn't expect them to be directly affected. But when we surveyed our grantee partners last spring in our annual partner survey, and we found that already 50% or so had been directly affected, not because they'd lost funds from USAID directly, although some had, but from other entities that had gotten stop work orders. So whether it's International Organization for Migration, UNHCR, UNICEF, in some cases they weren't even aware that their funding was tied originally to USAID, and so that had a huge effect. And some of it is, yes, scaling back programs and such, but one of the interesting things that popped out of those responses was the need to sort of responsibly tie off obligations in communities that they had already incurred. You get the stop work order, but you've already made commitments. And so some of the funding that we provided was to help these organizations retain the trust and confidence of the communities that they've worked so hard to build, in a case where it's very difficult to understand if you're in that community, all of a sudden you're not doing this thing that you promised. But it's not all doom and gloom out there either. So I think one of the things that I learned a couple of weeks ago when I was visiting partners in Cote d'Ivoire, West Africa, this is another earthquake in a long series of earthquakes that community-based organizations have faced over the years, whether it's conflict, whether it's pandemic, whether it's an Ebola epidemic. They're used to rolling with these punches. And these two particular organizations in a town called Man in kind of northwestern Cote d'Ivoire, they now find themselves in an environment where, yes, the ripple effects are severe. The problems that they've been trying to address in these communities are getting worse. And a lot of the international organizations that had been active in that region are now a lot less active or just gone. But here they are, having worked in these communities, continuing to work in these communities, and now are really key institutions in those communities that have the opportunity to form different kinds of relationships with government entities, different kind of relationships with local businesses, and they're doing that. And they're kind of expanding how they work in new ways to respond to the crisis. And so that's the message that they wanted me to pass along to this group, is that, yes, it is a very dreadful situation. And at the same time, there are plenty of strong, resilient organizations out there, prepared to do the work.
Thanks, John. I want to turn over to you now, Cathy. And John has sort of mentioned the topic of the question I'd like to ask you, which is this moment within the broader spectrum of the history, the recent history of the nonprofit sector. This is an earthquake following a series of earthquakes. And when we started to talk about this data as early as last fall, people were saying, well, gosh, COVID was, just the same kind of crisis, and now we're in the same kind of crisis again. Is this really different? I think you have a really interesting perspective on this. The Haas Junior Fund works on social justice issues that are often in the public eye, and certainly in the past, not without moments of perceived controversy. You've been supporters of LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights. You've been working on strengthening democracy. Does this moment feel different to you than the past, or is this more of the same?
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. And thank you very much, CEP, for having me here and also for this report. I think the value of confidential survey responses at a big scale really comes through. And, it's illuminating because, our grantee partners tell me how funny I am and, how good my hair looks. So, to get that real dose of reality is really important. And I really appreciate that this is coming out at the beginning of the year as we're thinking about how we're going to step up and our plans for 2026. So, yeah, from my point of view, I think we're seeing some pretty far out behavior. Masked and militarized ICE officers just nabbing people off the street in front of schools, houses of worship, or hospitals. Attempts to fully eliminate agencies like the EPA, USAID, like John mentioned, the Department of Education, the safety net getting decimated, and now, disaster relief potentially being doled out to certain states and not others. So, those are all new things. And, not that we haven't been challenged before, but for me, I think some of the most concerning things that are happening in this moment are, for example, the record number of court orders that are being ignored. And, you know, um, we believe in the Constitution, the rule of law. So ignoring a judge's ruling is really concerning. And that is not normal. And this has happened over and over again this past year, dozens and dozens of times. And then closer to home, for philanthropy, we're being accused of some pretty far out there things, funding domestic terrorism, of being agents of subversive foreign influence. Nothing could be further from the truth. And our freedom to give, our free speech rights as a sector are being challenged. So that is definitely uncharted territory. And I hear the skepticism even in the question, is this really different? This country has faced challenges before. The communities at the heart of our work have faced challenges before. And that is for sure. And so, one suggestion I would have to my many foundation colleagues that are online today is to listen. And what I would suggest, really contextualize these findings in your own community. And I think one of the really productive things you could do is reach out to 2 or 3 or 4 nonprofit leaders that you trust. People like Robin that are going to talk to you straight and that you have a good relationship with, people that you respect, and ask them, how was 2025 for you and your organization? What do you anticipate for your clients and your community members this coming year? What's been hard and what's hopeful? And just listen. And I say that, so about one evening a week, I do the soccer carpool. I'm a soccer mom, soccer carpool home. And so my 8th grade daughter is in the car with 2 of her buddies. And I just listen. I pretend like I'm driving, but I just listen. And I hear the tea, right? I hear what's going on, in front of the locker rooms with the coach, etc. Do that with your grantees and just listen. And then you'll really know what's happening in your backyard. And I bet you'll learn something. And you may even walk away with some new ideas of what you could be doing in your community. So back to you, Kevin.
Thanks, Cathy. That's actually the perfect segue to, I think, inviting Elisha back into the conversation to share the findings, the second 2 key findings from this report, which are really about what we heard when we listened to foundations about what they were doing, and we listened to nonprofits about how they felt about what foundations were doing. So I'm going to invite the 4 of us, Cathy, Robin, John, and I, to go off camera while Elisha comes back and talks to us about some more data.
All right, I'm gonna share my screen again here, and we will jump in with finding 2. So we talked in the first half of our time today about what we heard from nonprofits. And what we'll start to look at now is how foundations have responded to this moment. And what we learned, one of the big things we learned is that many foundation leaders recognize the high stakes of the current context for nonprofits, and they have made some changes to their grant making and to their processes in response. So almost 90% of foundation leaders, the vast majority of the over 220 leaders who responded to our survey, told us they experienced an increased demand for their funding last year. And generally, most foundations say that at least some of their own grantees experience the same challenges that we heard about from the nonprofits we surveyed, such as increased demand. But they also reported other challenges like pressure to reframe descriptions of their work, backlash to their missions, and concerns about staff well-being and safety. Now, in the face of these challenges, many foundation leaders have made changes, sometimes significant, to their work and operations to help their grantees weather the current storm. Almost 2/3 report providing emergency or rapid response grants. Almost half provided or increased their provision of assistance beyond the grant, and about 40% have started or increased their provision of unrestricted grants. Notably, almost 1/3 of leaders also report increasing their foundation's payout rate in response to the current context. As one leader shared on their foundation's decision to increase payout, I think for any organization, how you show up in moments of challenge really defines you. Yes, 5% is a floor, but it's always been set at 5%. Our framework and criteria for when we consider giving more should not just be when we're able to. It should be based on the needs of the community. First and foremost, we are here to serve the community. Another leader whose foundation changed some of its processes in response to the current context shared the following with us. We basically backed away from reporting requirements. So the grantees would have to adhere to the report requirements if they wanted to just tell us over the phone how things were going. We wanted to give them as much flexibility as possible. Now, when we asked leaders who were providing assistance beyond the grant what they're offering to grantees, foundations most often reported supporting new collaborations with grantees or other funders, providing resources for staff well-being, and providing legal support assistance. We have focused on building up leaders in our community, emphasizes one foundation leader when talking about the decision to provide non-monetary support, recognizing their talents and gifts so they can meet this moment right now. This is just as important as money, seeing these leaders, affirming their worth, and letting them know we believe in them. It matters. We also heard from leaders about how foundations and nonprofits are both seeing this moment. So our third and final finding is that many foundation and nonprofit leaders believe that foundations have an even larger role to play in supporting nonprofits during this time. And many suggest that foundations could and should be doing more. As shown on this slide, over 80% of the funders we interviewed believe foundations have a really significant role to play in supporting the nonprofit sector. However, we did also hear from 20% of leaders in our interviews that they don't believe foundations have much responsibility to help nonprofits in navigating the challenges of the current context. So foundation leaders are not completely aligned in terms of what foundations' role should be in supporting nonprofits during this time. That sentiment is exemplified in the quote shown here. As this foundation leader says, regardless of this or any other shortfall, nonprofits have to understand it's not the requirement of the foundation to make sure they have enough operational funding. You have to grow to an extent that you can take care of yourself. And don't expect somebody to give you money because you want it. What's more, while only about 40% of the foundation leaders we interviewed expressed dissatisfaction with the way funders have responded to the challenges that are posted by the current context, almost all of the nonprofit leaders we talked to, 93%, said they were disappointed with Foundation's overall response to this moment. This foundation leader is one that told us about their dissatisfaction with their peers in the sector. In this time, I've really been questioning the value and the utility of institutional legacy philanthropy. They said, I see institutional philanthropy, which has never been the boldest of players, moving more and more towards so-called non-controversial areas of work. Now, this next piece of data is particularly interesting. We asked both foundations and nonprofit leaders how effective they felt like their foundation had been in each of the following areas in relation to their grantees in 2025. And we see overall that funders rated themselves quite highly on their effectiveness, their responsiveness, and communication. However, when we compare these answers to nonprofit leaders' responses, we see that nonprofits rate funders much lower than funders rate themselves. Clearly, there is a significant mismatch in perception of funders' effectiveness in responding to the challenges faced by their grantees. So, what can funders who do want to support their grantees or get better at doing so during this time, what can they do according to the leaders we surveyed? Well, the most common suggestion we heard was for some foundations to provide capacity building support to their grantees. For example, helping them to build skills, cultivate relationships, and acquire resources to more effectively respond to challenges. And for funders and nonprofits to get better at communicating with each other. So to wrap up all these findings, we wanted to share a quote from a foundation leader who expressed the following encouragement for their fellow funders. We foundations are part of civil society. That is incredibly unique when we think about our countries, when we think about other countries. Private philanthropy has enough independence and freedom to use our resources in ways that others cannot. We have a responsibility to fight back and push back in this moment and to be strategic. So to summarize everything we've discussed today, nonprofits report that they are dealing with existential challenges to their work, facing both increased demand and decreased funding. As a result, a number of funders have made changes to their grant making and grant making processes, stepping up payout, making more emergency grants, and giving more assistance beyond the grant. And finally, both foundation and nonprofit leaders tell us that foundations as a whole should be doing even more to support nonprofits. So what comes next? The challenges facing the nonprofit sector are ongoing and new challenges are always on the horizon. But CEP plans to continue to collect timely data on how the social sector is dealing with and responding to these challenges throughout 2026. And I'll pause here for more discussion from the panel.
Thanks, Elisha, and I'll invite Robin and John and Cathy to return to the screen. And while they do, I'm going to remind all of you that there is a question box at the bottom of your webinar interface where you can raise some of your own questions. I have a few more based on the findings that Elisha just shared that I want to kick us off with, and then we're going to move to your questions. So please do share them. We have a good number of them already, and we know there's a lot of value in addressing the concerns that are top of mind for you. Now, for the panel, I want to invoke the analogy that, or the experience that Cathy referred to earlier. Let's just pretend that we are 5 people in the back of the minivan, that there aren't 900 other people sitting in the front of the minivan listening in on our conversation. So, Robin, I'm curious what you make of these findings from about the experience of how foundations are reacting to this moment and nonprofits' perceptions of that. Could you kick us off with something about what you think one of your funders might have done well that supported Mend in this moment? And maybe, without naming names, unless you really want to, you could talk about something that's been frustrating for you and your experience with your funders.
Sure. Yes. So I would say there's a lot of really great stuff happening with funders. One is we are definitely seeing the trend of more operating funds coming in, operating grants versus program specific. That's really helpful. Also helps us, really put the money where we need it to keep the business going. And I think the other thing is there's been a lot of really exciting, great work happening in the nonprofit world in terms of coalitions and advocacy work. So for more collective impact. And I am seeing a shift, in the last couple of years of funders being really more interested in that than in the past. So I think those are like two big, great points. I think where there are challenges, I'm not calling anyone out, but I would say, there's some stress in the nonprofit world around innovation. So like where funders are like, give us something innovative right now. Most of us are like, our programs work. They are solid. We have feedback loops, just let us keep doing the work that's working. So I would say that's one thing I would flag. And then from Men's perspective specifically, we're very focused on dignity and leading with dignity. And so sometimes that can feel at odds with a lot of deep requests for data. I appreciate the data is important and needed for decision making, especially around funding, but we don't always have, and that's by choice, deep information on demographics, ages of children, like things that some funders really want to know. So I guess I would say there, if there's room to really think about like why you need to know, or can you just trust that like when you know the nonprofits and you're partnering with them, they're doing good work, that they're making the decisions based on more qualitative data sometimes, and that should be okay as well.
Thanks, Robin. I'm sure we're going to come back to those topics. I can see a few of them mentioned in some of the questions that are coming in. But before we go there, John and Cathy, I'll turn to each of you respectively and ask you just a simple question. What have you done differently to respond to this moment at the organizations that you lead? John, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think one donor, I think it is important to acknowledge, because her meeting the moment has allowed us to meet the moment and do some of the things that we've done, and that's Mackenzie Scott. Her first grant to us allowed us to start an emergency fund, which in this moment has been incredibly important. And that's been different for us to have those discretionary funds available to be able to meet those immediate needs. In one specific instance is an organization we've been in solidarity with and funding for many years called Chanan Development Association in Pakistan. They were, as far as I can tell, they were our partner the most affected by the USAID cuts, had two massive contracts canceled pretty soon after the dismantling. We were able to provide a pretty modest size pivot grant, and they have taken on some strategy advice and have now reformed their organization in a different way, and have gathered together a lot of funding to maintain their position in the ecosystem in Pakistan as a key organization, galvanizing youth for a variety of positive purposes. And so it for us, it hasn't been doing things differently, because the core of maintaining those really close relationships with our partners so they feel free to share their challenges and needs with us. What's different is our ability to actually respond to those needs extremely quickly and with a lot of flexibility, which has been just critical for us in this moment to meet the needs of our grantee partners and ourselves.
Thanks, Sean. And Cathy, over to you now. Anything that you want to share that you've done or done differently to respond to this moment?
Yeah, thanks. And I hear the tension between, look, um, just help us keep going with the tried and true versus innovating. And I I really believe that, and I'm sure Robin, your shop is doing this. I really believe that we have to figure out how to tackle things in new ways. And taking the same playbook and doing 10% more this year is just not going to be enough. And I think this is one of the beautiful things about philanthropy is we can be that R&D money to try something new. That's really hard to do with government money. It's hard to do with other types of money. So it's a superpower that we have. Um, well, so I'll give you a specific about something we're doing in California. And Haas Junior has always been a funder that values collaboration and working together and partnership. And I think I have found a lot of strength from watching what has happened in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and just the small actions of neighbors helping neighbors added up to something powerful. And I think even with just those of us on this webinar, if we took actions together and partnered, big things could happen. So I'm a really big believer in partnership and the kind of collective action that Robbins talks about. And in this moment, collaboration and working together is also our best protection. This is not a time to go it alone. And what I mean by that is when you have many partners, there's strength in those numbers. And one of the things that we've been doing in California is pushing back on some of the illegal behavior, like, for example, unfreezing federal homelessness dollars that we were owed. And over 36 of us funders have come together to work on this, which is, I think, a new high watermark in terms of the number of partners. And we have very small funders or modest funders, and we have very big funders that are joining together. And what's really exciting is that we are spanning many issue areas, education to climate to immigration to healthcare. And we're really trying to think about our communities more comprehensively. And so, for example, at Haas Junior, we don't have an elderly program or a safety net program, but we definitely care about seniors losing their health care. And there's a climate funder that I met through this process. I mean, it's pretty ridiculous because his office is about 3 blocks away from mine. And we've never joined forces in this way. And this climate funder also cares about immigrant rights, cares about the safety net, et cetera. And so working in partnership has really, truly given us more impact as well as protection and strength. And so I really, again, don't do anything alone right now. This is a time for you to find your allies so that you can be bolder and work together for new solutions and support one another and rise to the moment.
All right, I'm going to move us into some of the questions that we're starting to get from our audience, recognizing that we have about 25 minutes, 30 minutes left in this conversation today. Thank you for everything you all shared so far. One of the questions, I'm hearing a couple tensions raised already, and I'm seeing them raised in the questions we're getting from the audience as well. So there's the tension between a moment where nonprofits and the communities and people they're supporting are facing incredible challenges, increased demand for their services at a time of decreased resources, right? So that calls on us to continue some of the work that's been happening. And we hear the need to work differently and innovate and try new approaches. Balancing those is hard. Another tension that comes up, it's been talked about already in this panel, and I see it in the comments in a couple ways, is this question about how do we navigate filling gaps that government leaves behind versus raising the alarm that government is leaving these gaps behind, right? So let's start with that one. Um, how have you all thought about this really difficult question of how and where to fill gaps and potentially let government off the hook versus um, let those gaps remain in order to help make the point that government needs to be creating the safety net and the legal rights that we all require. So I'm going to open up to any of you who would like to weigh in on this question of how do you navigate that really fundamental tension?
Well, I'm happy to start, and I think the answer is advocacy. And we at Haas Junior have kind of learned this the hard way. We were a services funder, and if you try to fund scholarships, for example, you just don't get the kind of scale that you want by funding scholarships one by one, as you do when you get your public sector to do more and to make scholarships happen. And I think Robin certainly can talk more about this, but the SNAP crisis that we faced in the fall was a great example. Um, SNAP is something like 9 billion a month to run. Like we could have drained all of our endowments and like been able to go 6 weeks to continuation. It just that kind of quid pro quo replacement isn't possible for us. And so instead, California joined 25 other states, including Kentucky and Wisconsin, a really diverse array of states, half of the states in the country, and sued the federal government to get SNAP payments to start going again. And it is that type of different thinking. You know, I never thought about joining forces with other states. I'm a, local funder, but it is that type of thinking that I think we need to try to experiment with in this moment.
Yeah, and I can jump in as well. I mean, I agree with you, Cathy. Like we know like what the government can do through SNAP is way more impactful than what a food pantry can accomplish. So yes to advocacy, yes to collaboration. And then I think just from a very practical standpoint, making a decision at the nonprofit level of like where are we focusing our energy? Where can we have the most impact with the amount of resources we have? Obviously, we're going to build in some growth planning, but we know we want to be in our case, communities that have been designated by the state as food desert communities. We want to be working more with families with young children. That's a choice we're making. Would we love to be able to solve hunger and have healthy, fresh and healthy food for everyone in Essex County, New Jersey? Of course we would. Can we do that through collaborating with other partners? Maybe. If we're all talking to each other, if we are working, with government partners, with philanthropy. So there's momentum there. I think it's collaboration, coalitions leading to advocacy so that comprehensively we're able to tackle more together.
I think similar dynamic in the international space because, with the collapse of the system as it was, there's something, well, can't philanthropy fill those gaps? Well, there's a math problem. There isn't enough funding in philanthropy to fill those gaps. And if there were, then, philanthropy probably would not want to fill those gaps in that particular way. And philanthropy has been playing an important role for years and trying to shift how the work of USAID in particular, and then other government agencies was happening to be more locally led, to be more accessible and more equitable. The truth is a lot of folks were not happy with how it was working. Nobody wanted it to collapse in the way it did, but there's a really important role in shaping, what comes next. And that is where that solidarity and leadership within philanthropy, in the effort to really reimagine what the U.S. government's role should be and how it conducts any future iteration of foreign assistance, there's a lot that philanthropy can teach, and a lot that philanthropy can influence. And I also have really welcomed over the past year the different kinds of groupings that have come together to really take that on.
Elisha, can I invite you in on this question? There was actually a specific question in the Q&A for you about this on this topic of innovation. Can you share with us a specific example, if you have one handy, about what you heard in these interviews and survey responses about the ways in which a nonprofit might have innovated its business model or strategy to protect operating approaches that are still crucial, or to create new ones that that meet a new conception of the moment that we're going to be facing in the coming years?
Sure, Kevin. I mean, I would say one of the things that was most amazing about this study was the opportunity to talk with nonprofit leaders and foundation leaders around the country. And those conversations were really inspiring because folks were doing super creative things in the face of tremendous odds. And so one example, for instance, an organization that we talked to in one of the interviews, they were thinking about, just other creative funding mechanisms. And they run an organization that did a lot of work around media. And so they had come up with this new innovative kind of line of work where they were continuing to produce media, but they were like using the space as a space where corporations could rent out that space and use the space to produce media, but using it in a way that allowed them to continue to work with young people and train young people in doing that media, but the organization was receiving funds for doing it. And so that's just one example of many that we heard of folks who were like coming up with these creative strategies to get new sources of revenue. And then there are also, a lot of resources out there, like Nonprofit Financial Commons, for instance, has been having a series of webinars recently around just this piece around thinking creatively about revenue and what other ways are for nonprofits to be plugging into different resources in that way too.
Elisha, can you say the name of that organization again? I think it responds to one of the other questions we see in the chat now about who's providing resources for nonprofits to think about things like mergers, shutting down responsibly a program, and so forth.
Yeah, the Nonprofit Financial Commons has been doing a lot of work in this area.
Thank you. Okay, I want to move to one of the other findings in the survey that has come up in a number of the questions. What the heck is up with the 20% of funders who don't think they feel much responsibility to support nonprofits navigating this moment? The floor is open.
Okay, that was one of the most perplexing findings of the study for me. And because I'm a true believer of this sector and the potential of this sector to solve community problems and be an important part of the fabric of our communities, I thought of the 80% that really believe that this moment is important. And even the other, you're finding number 3, Elisha, where 93% of the funders said they understand grantee challenges. 91% said that they're being responsive, but then the actual response was like half of that. I as a glass half full person, I looked at that and I thought, okay, the aspirations are there. People think they're doing this. The aspirations are there. And now we need to deliver. I think our existential moment in this sector right now is we have to really live our mission and our values. I'm guessing all of you have beautiful missions about community and lifting people up. And now those are being challenged. And so we've got to step up. And then the last thing I'd say is I do think we're overdosing on fear in our sector right now. And we need to counterbalance that with some courage. And I get the fear. Kevin told you, we are an immigrant rights and a democracy funder. We help college access and success for Black and Latino low-income students. I mean, it is so easy to let your lawyers fill your heads with risks and what can go wrong and worst case scenario thinking. And I have a very expensive lawyer that does that for me too. But I think it's an everyday practice to not let that fear take up so much real estate in your head. You got to balance that out with your instincts and your sense of what's right, your own moral compass, your sense of purpose, the need to be resolute, and your deep, deep belief in your mission and your values. And at Haas Junior, we don't do anything illegal, and we cross our I's and we dot our T's. But we're also not going to hide under our desks for the next 3 years. And what I don't think is happening enough in our sector is we're not factoring in the regret that we will have by being on the sidelines when history is being made. And we're not factoring in the risk of inaction. 2025, 2026, 2027, 2028 are going to be in the history books. And for me, I want us to be proud of our sector. I want to say, hey, we did our part. And I think your board members want to be on the right side of history too. I know mine do.
Yeah, I'm wondering about that 20% too. I haven't spoken with anyone that I would kind of assume would be in that 20%. And but that difference between foundation's perception of how they're doing and nonprofits, as being both grant maker and grant seeker, I'm simultaneously feeling those two things. I'm really confident because of our latest grantee perception report results that we're in sync with our grantees, which is great, to hear that we appear to be meeting the moment for them and with them. It has been tough as a grant seeker, and I get it. I get the fear. I get the wanting to make sure there's you're making the right moves, that there's enough leverage, that you're not catching a falling knife by putting money into something that's not going to make it. It's not just the rainy day, although it is a rainy day on the nonprofit side of things, but it is something more than that I think Cathy was capturing really well. It's a particular moment in time that feels unprecedented, and we're not experiencing the same level of sort of immediate generosity and outpouring like we did in especially the early stages of COVID, for example. So it does feel different. But there's, again, I keep coming back to, there are so many opportunities out there to meet that moment.
Okay. I'm going to move us along, and recognizing we are now down to, I've been reminded, 7 minutes before I have to hand it back to Sarah. I'm going to ask us to do a bit of a lightning round of questions, and you don't have to respond to every one of them. I'm wondering if each of you who can share an example. We've been talking about advocacy efforts and coalition building, a specific example of a coalition approach or a place where the folks on this webinar could look for solidarity or opportunity to join an advocacy or other kind of coalition to meet this moment. Any ideas pop to mind? I see you nodding, John, so maybe you can kick us off.
Several. I mean, I just to stand up to my dog Pearl, but shout out to the Council on Foundations that has been really great at convening foundations together, briefing us on issues, and helping forge new relationships. I've also really valued sort of a semi-organized group of peer organizations that have got together and started to do some things together years. So those are two that I can point to that have been pretty helpful for me, and having solidarity and us having folks to bounce ideas formed has been really helpful.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I can pretty much guarantee most of your nonprofit friends are part of some kind of coalition. So I would say, I mean, that has been loud and clear since 2020. I think we all have gotten the message like we need to work together. So I would say just talk to your nonprofit leader friends. They would invite you happily to join one. MEND is the backbone of a coalition called FEC, Food and Health Equity Coalition of Essex County. And we get great participation from foundations. They come, they listen, they ask questions. We have one foundation that even did a special grant just to members of our coalition, and extra money if you partnered with a coalition member. So I would say there's opportunity there. So talk to your nonprofit friends. And then I'll just say for those, I know this is New Jersey specific, but there is the Office of Food Security Advocate in New Jersey, and they have a lot of knowledge and information around coalitions around the state specific to the food space.
Yeah, and I'll mention Unite in Advance if you all haven't heard about our sector effort. A big props to the McKnight Foundation, MacArthur, and Freedom Together. It's really in defense of philanthropy, civil society, our ability to give freely, our protection of freedom of speech. And it has become a very big tent. And it continues to be so inclusive. And through that coalition, some of us have been able to get together on our various issue spaces. And literally last time there was an in-person meeting, it was profound. There were, 150 people there, and I don't think anybody knew half of the room. And so there is this moment in this crisis, and I would encourage you to take advantage of this part of the crisis. There are really opportunities to do things differently and to bust out and try something new. And I think also, good behavior is happening. People are increasing their payout. They're doing more general support. They're trying to do more new grants, et cetera, and new partnerships. And it's up to us as leaders in the sector to make sure those don't fade away with this moment, and that we make some of these, we move them to muscle memory and make this part of our new normal. So anyways, United in Advance, I'll put my phone number or my email in the chat. And honestly, all of your foundation presidents are welcome. So I would encourage you to join that effort.
And then I was just going to mention the work of the National Council of Nonprofits. They've been a steady force throughout this time. And I think the coalition they've built, they've actually filed several lawsuits that have been successful. And they also are doing something else that I think is really important, which is they have a campaign all about just raising awareness about what nonprofits do in communities around the country. Because part of the issue that we face right now is there are a lot of folks who maybe don't understand that when they're in an after-school program or when they're going to the food bank or other places in the community, that those organizations are nonprofits and that nonprofits are the backbone of so many communities. And so I think the campaign that they're doing to raise awareness to that work, the lawsuits that the National Council of Nonprofits is filing, and they're doing that, in partnership with other organizations like Independent Sector. I think that those coalitions are super important right now as well.
Thanks, all of you. Okay. There are so many good questions remaining in the chat. Why hasn't the Mackenzie Scott effect been embraced by more funders? What are the specific examples of the ways that nonprofits and funders have become more agile beyond just providing more operating costs or streamlined grant-making processes? But I want to stick on this topic of the United Advance campaign for funders. And I think it was that campaign and John Palfrey who used the tagline, "Courage is contagious." And we've seen that in responses throughout the country. In Minneapolis, come obviously in these last months. But this is a really hard time. If this data says one thing to all of us, it's that for both funders and nonprofits, these are moments of real challenge. So I'm wondering if each of you could close with an example of something that you have done to maintain courage and morale in your organizations. You're the leaders of your organization. So what have you done to maintain courage and morale in this challenging moment? And I'm going to ask you each to take no more than like 45 seconds.
Well, I will say, I think most nonprofit leaders are most worried about their teams right now. So I love this question. For us, I think it's centering back on the community, right? And so we do a team meeting once a month where we share stories of impact with one another, recognizing that each of us have a part to play in making that impact. And that's been really uplifting, to keep us kind of motivated. And, we certainly feel needed. So, so it helps. It helps to just get that message to everyone.
I think for me, I always hang out with some young, undocumented immigrants and campus advocates because they have that idealism and that spirit of, you can't tell me I can't do that. What is that about? And as I get older, I know I need a dose of that because I'm like, the lawyer voice is on this side, and oh boy, what about my board? And and we need some of that unleashed, unbridled sense of possibility. So however you can get that. I have a few colleagues that are, let's run, let's do for that, let's go for it. And you got to check your lawyer side with the go for it side, and just be mindful of that balance is what I would suggest.
Elisha, John?
Sure. I would say two things. One is to just focus on moments of joy, right? Because even with everything that's happening, life is still lifing also, right? So people are having babies or other celebrations in their life or changes, or so just trying to make sure to pause and actually celebrate those things, I think is super important. And then secondly, I just fully concur with Cathy, just like actively being in the community where we are. Just last night, I was with a group of 6th to 8th grade girls. There is nothing more centering than hearing their thoughts about what is currently happening. So I think just finding spaces and ways and organizations to be in community is always important, but even more important right now.
John, you get the final couple sentences.
100% endorse what Elisha just said, drawing energy from the partners we serve around the world, and being in solidarity with them and with others, kind of recognizing the moment we're in and rising to it.
Thank you. Well, on behalf of our audience, I really want to thank Elisha, Robin, Cathy, and John for joining us today and sharing both data and wisdom with all of us. I'm turning it back over to Sarah to close us out. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kevin. And a huge thank you to our panelists, to John, Robin, Cathy, Elisha. It's been such a pleasure having you. And a huge thank you to you all for joining us. We will be sending a recording out, as we mentioned, next week, and we'll include the list of resources that have come up during this conversation, some of which in the chat, some of which I've saved otherwise from the Q&A, and we'll be sending that out next week. I also just wanted to mention that you'll be receiving a survey in your inbox if you haven't already, just asking for feedback on this event, because we're always trying to improve our program offerings. So if you could take 2 minutes to fill it out, it would mean a lot to us. And thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you next time. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.